So first of all, welcome, Tony. The jobs to be done is becoming an integral part of how we teach innovation, creativity, technology, commercialization, and so it's a real, I'm going to say, pleasure, honor to be here with someone that basically spends their waking days thinking about it and, more importantly, applying it. So could you just start by kind of giving me like the backstory? What took you into looking at things through a jobs to be done framework?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. It's interesting. So my career started at IBM. I was working as a process engineer back on the PC junior line. So this is back in the mid 80s. And we worked really hard at trying to get that product just right. And it was supposed to change the world. It was bringing home computing to the masses. This was after Apple had their release of their product. So we were very excited about it. And the day after that product was introduced, the headlines in the Wall Street Journal read, PC Junior is a flop. And we thought, it is? How could that possibly be? It's impossible. We didn't believe it for about a year. Unfortunately, it was a flop. It cost us about $1 billion. And what really got my interest was the fact that they called it so quick. It was the day after it was released. So obviously they were using some set of metrics to say that product didn't address the metrics I thought needed to be addressed in order to have a successful product. And I thought, well, if we only knew what those metrics were the week before or the year before, we could just design the product around those metrics, and then they'd say, the PC Junior is the greatest thing since sliced bread. So it really set me down a path to try to figure out what are those metrics, and how can we get them way in advance? So that's when I started looking at everything that was available at the time. This was the mid 80s, so this was when QFD was coming along. It was voice of the customer just started, and conjoint analysis was new. A lot of fun things. And we spent a lot of time delving into every one of those approaches, and we realized that there still wasn't a cohesive way to innovate. So we set out to find a new way to innovate. And so it occurred to me, this was on an assignment. I was working with IBM at the time in Australia on a project, and that's when it occurred to me. It's if we could just focus on the underlying process, make that the unit of analysis, we'll just break it down as a process. As a process engineer, I love that. So as soon as I thought of it that way, it's like, well, this is what we do all the time in the manufacturing line. What do we need to measure and control to produce a predictable output? I thought, well, maybe we could figure out what do the customers measure as used as a measure of success when they're trying to get this job done. And we didn't call it job at that point. It was just the underlying process. So we went down that path, and lo and behold, it produced some great results. So we kept refining it over the years, and that's what I've been doing for the last 25 years, is refining that approach, so that it enables us to discover unmet needs, it enables us to discover hidden segments of opportunity. And of course, once we know where the unmet needs are and the underserved segments are, then we can define the right strategy to pursue, the right way to align our products with the value propositions, and it feeds in the business model canvas and a lot of other great tools that exist, and just fills that gap that was missing and fills that hole for innovation.
So, without going through the whole process, and maybe I'm trying to shorten the answer too much, but the thing that I've noticed when I talk to people in organizations about using a jobs to be done framework than the traditional way they analyze markets, which is like demographics or something else, can you kind of highlight what the key differences are when you're looking at what jobs need to be done versus the traditional way of looking at a market?
Sure. It starts from the way we define a market. So we don't define a market around a product or a technology. We define a market as a group of people and the job they're trying to get done. So that's the first difference, because most companies don't think about their markets in that sense. They think about it as a technology. The CD market, the MP3 market, the semiconductor market. These are all technologies that are used to get a job done. So the first step in getting it all right is defining the market correctly. Defining the group of people you want to target is one thing, and that can be tough too, because there's often multiple people that you have to create value for, but there's always the person who's actually using the product to get a job done. We call that the job executor. And And so we define the market around that person, like in the surgical area, for example. You're selling to a hospital, selling surgical tools. Well, you have a buying group buying the product. You have a nurse setting up the product. The surgeon uses the product, and someone else disposes or cleans the product, a biomed, for example. Who's the customer? Well, the answer is they're all the customer, but the surgeon's actually the one using the product to get some job done. Everything else is in preparation thereof. Buying it, putting it in stock, taking it out of stock, getting it ready for use. We call all those consumption chain jobs, all in preparation for that core functional job, which is to maybe replace a hip or whatever the surgical procedure might be. So understanding that that's the focal point puts everything else in perspective. And
So I agree with you, but I'm going to challenge you a bit because all of those people that you just described could actually stop you from buying that.
that's right.
So they all have a job to be done, maybe not as important, right? And I think, well, one of the things we try to do is to say, what job are you doing for the buying group? What job are you doing for the hospital administrator? What job are you doing for the nurse? Because if I know sometimes you try and have to consider too many things, but there are sometimes simple things that you could do for the other people in that consumption chain
Yeah.
that would stop them resisting. For example, one of the examples we had in class this week was packaging embedded training with the product. So when you get it, it's already got the training material embedded. So I think you talked about ease of use, right? So people get up to speed using it very fast.
That's right.
And that wasn't for maybe the expert like the surgeon, but it might be for the nurse or the anesthetist or something.
Well, that's right. And so they're all part of the customer chain, if you will. But knowing where to start is critical. So if the product doesn't work for the surgeon, the buyer's not going to buy it. They're not going to put it in stock. The nurse will never take it, right? So first and foremost, it has to be a good surgical tool. So we use that as the focal point. You have to start somewhere. So do you start at the purchase point? Do you start with the nurse?
Okay.
Do you start with the buyer? And the answer is no. You start with the person who's eventually going to use the product. That's the anchor, right? And now you're going to build all your other analysis around that person. So we call that surgeon, in that case, that's the job executor, and the job they're trying to get done is to repair a rotator cuff. Let's use that. All right. Now, when we think of it like that, now there's other jobs that relate to that core job. So we call them consumption chain jobs. The product has to be purchased. Well, who purchased the product? Well, that's a buyer or a buyer group. They have a whole different set of metrics that they're using to measure value. In fact, they use financial metrics. And in the medical space, the buyer almost never uses the product. So they don't even know what all these metrics are here that the surgeon or the nurse uses to measure value. They have a different view, right? So understanding their financial metrics is absolutely critical to win over the buyer, right? Now, come back here to this core functional job for a second. If we can get that job done better, let's define better, right? Better means we can get it done faster, we can get it done more predictably, we can get it done higher output throughput. Does that have a financial implication? It sure does. So we can get it done faster, more predictably, higher output throughput along certain functional dimensions. Once we've done that and we understood what these unmet needs are over here, then we can say, okay, here's what we've invented from a functional standpoint. How does that impact these financial metrics that are of interest to the buyer? And we take our value proposition, define it for the buyer, and that's the value prop we use for the buyer. The value prop we use for the user is something totally different. But again, anchor here. If we can create value for them, it will interest the buyer. So that's one lesson. Another part is the nurse plays a role here as well. So they need to set up the product. They need to unpack it. They need to put it on the tray. So all that's part of what we call a consumption chain. So you can talk to the nurse about going through those steps and understanding where they might be deficient or where other products are more effective. And if we can figure out where the nurse is underserved along certain dimensions, we can create more value for the nurse as well. So this is pretty common. When we do work for our clients, we'll talk to the surgeon, we'll talk to the nurse, we'll talk to the buyer, and understand all these different metrics that come into play. But we got to keep in mind the order in which we're thinking about this. The nurse isn't making the buying decision, the nurse isn't using the product, but they're supporting along some part of the way. So we have to prioritize these. And we always prioritize the job executor as number one. So I think that goes back to answering your question.
No. So absolutely no. I 100% agree that you have to have an order of magnitude, and some of them you cannot ever design for, but you can consider some of them. We try to focus on barriers to adoption and removing them, and so that's kind of another way of looking at jobs to be done.
It is, because barriers to adoption can come in any of those areas.
Right.
The buyer could have a barrier to adoption because it's not addressing a financial metric. The nurse could have a barrier to adoption because it's hard to set up or it's hard to learn how to use. And of course, the surgeon could have a barrier to adoption because it doesn't address the needs as well as some other products.
So let me ask you a more detailed question about the process of, especially unmet needs. You talk about the importance of chatting with people, asking them, but we also know that there's an issue with that. In Clay Christensen's famous milkshake example, if he'd asked people why they hire milkshakes, they would have kind of given him a funny look. So it's a mixture of observation and then the right follow-up questions. So can you talk a little bit about you talked about Bosch and 16 unmet needs or something on the sort. Can you talk a little bit about how you dig down and actually pull out what those unmet needs are? Because maybe people aren't, I'm wondering how you go through, maybe people aren't even aware of them yet.
Sure, so I'd be happy to. So the way we accomplish that's through two phases. One is the qualitative phase, where we capture the needs, then the quantitative phase, where we figure out which are unmet. So let's separate those out, distinctly different. So in the first phase, the goal is to come up with a set of needs, and we do qualitative interviews, typically one-on-one. The first step is to figure out what is the job they're trying to get done. So we may run 3, 4, 5, 10 interviews just to figure out what is the job. In some more complicated cases, it could take even more work. I'll give you one quick example. If we're looking at the jobs that people use social media for, or banking, or smart homes, there's lots of jobs. Or all the jobs people are trying to get done while driving, lots of jobs. So where do you start? In cases like social media, we look at all the reasons people are using social media, and then we actually go quantify those to see which are important, which are unsatisfied, and we run factor analysis on that to figure out how they cling together. So if all the things that they do, certain things cling together and they form some abstracted job. And so from that we can figure out, like in the case of social media, there's 7 core jobs that people are trying to get done using social media. Of all the things, of the over almost 200 reasons why people are using it, but it could be netted down to 7 core jobs. In the case of driving, people trying to get jobs done while driving, there were over 250 different jobs people are trying to get done while driving. They should be driving. And the question that our client had was, well, obviously we're not going to go create 250 products, so what's the fewest number of platform level solutions we could create to satisfy all 200 plus jobs? And so we did similar analysis, and we figured out all those 250 jobs netted down to 14 core jobs, all of which could be executed on 5 different technology platforms that already existed inside the vehicle. So it's that kind of thing. So that's the most complicated case. But in most cases, you can just go to your customer, like the kettle maker. We talked about that. You use the kettle to boil water, but it's really part of a bigger job, which is to create a hot beverage for consumption. Right. So now that's the abstracted level of the job. So that might take 3 or 4 interviews. Now we know the job. Then we create the job map. I love the job map. It helps guide where you're going to go in the future. The way I like thinking about this is, first off, it's not a process map, it's not a customer journey map. The way I like thinking about this is, there are people all over the world who are trying to execute this job, right? And they might be using 50 different solutions, all these different geographies. And this job map, one job map, is going to describe accurately what all those people are trying to do all around the world, independent of whatever solution they're using. It'll be correct for everybody. And the reason that's true is because it describes what they're trying to do, because they're all trying to get the same job done. They're all trying to go through the same steps. And there's always planning steps, there's gathering input steps, and so on. So we've documented that pretty nicely in an HBR piece called the Customer Centered Innovation Map that details the job mapping concept. And we've been doing that for a good 15 plus years. So that's very effective. To capture that job map, we'll typically interview 5, 10 people individually, one at a time, and build it out and refine it and validate it and refine it and validate it until we're comfortable that that's the job map. Now, we may not be 100% correct at this point, but we're close. Then we conduct more qualitative interviews and talk about each step in the job. And we ask people to take us through that step. How does it begin? Where do you struggle? What makes it time consuming? What makes it inefficient, go off track, unpredictable? And all those kinds of questions guide them to tell us about problems in getting the job done. Right? So we don't talk about solutions whatsoever. We're just focused on those jobs and those outcomes. And from those conversations, we extract the bits of information and we put it into the language that we use to define an outcome. And through many interviews, we fill in each step in the job map. Next interview, a few more outcomes. Next interview, a few more outcomes. And after we've done 10 or 15 interviews, we have a pretty good set of customer needs. So that's all just to get the needs. Right? Now we want to go figure out which needs are unmet. Here we use quantitative research. So we don't rely on 90 qualitative interviews and see what needs are unmet. The goal of qualitative is only to get the needs. We move to quantitative to figure out which are unmet. So we may interview anywhere from 180 to, we've done up to 14,000 people in certain cases. And we ask them to tell us how important each of these needs are and the level of satisfaction using whatever product they're using today. And we ask them what that product is so they tell us so we know what they're using. And then we get these data points and we can figure out the strengths and weaknesses of all these different products that exist and where each product is missing the boat, where the opportunities lie. So that's the second phase. From there's some more sophisticated techniques that we use to discover what I think is really the most important part of the process, and that is there are always segments of customers with different unmet needs. Right? It's marketing 101, and it's true. Not all customers are going to agree that needs 10, 20, 30 are all important and satisfied. There's going to be disagreement. The question is why, right? Why doesn't everybody agree? Well, what we've learned is that certain people encounter different complexities as they go about and get the job done. I'll give you a quick example. In the dental space, we've done work with dentists for tooth restorations. And some dentists describe how easy a tooth restoration is. You get the patient, they get healthy gums, put in a small filling. It's no problem. Makes sense. Well, we talked to another dentist and find out that there's a group of people that are very underserved because the last case they did was a patient who had unhealthy gums. They were bleeding. They were putting in a large filling, and bleeding makes visualization more difficult. Keeping the area dry becomes more difficult. And all of a sudden, all these needs are underserved in that situation. So now we have a place to focus, right? Do we want to go after the overserved segment and try to come up with a lower cost solution that maybe doesn't get the job done well for those healthy gum, low, small cavity situations? Or do we want to come up with a product that will get the job done better when we're dealing with a patient with unhealthy gums and a larger cavity where they spend most of their time in complication as a dentist? Are they willing to pay more to get this job done better in that situation? Certainly. So if we want to pursue a differentiated strategy in that space, we would make that decision based on that set of inputs. So all we've done in all that work is decided what the needs are, which are unmet, and are there segments of customers with different unmet needs. Basic marketing 101.
No,
Just a little science behind it.
You make it sound simple, but the reality is you're kind of putting formal processes in things that have traditionally not had that level of formal process, and therefore,
That's right.
We use it's a creative problem solving process, and you're just navigating around the steps of the creative problem solving process.
What we've done is we defined what a need is. We all agree that we're trying to satisfy needs. Well, what's a need? And until we can define what a need is, we can't define all those causal factors that contribute to variability in the process. We need to know that there is a core job you're trying to get done, and there are consumption chain jobs, and there are financial metrics that the buyer's using, and there are related jobs and emotional jobs. If we don't know all that, then you could lose on any of those fronts. But once you've identified all the variables in the equation, you can systematically figure out where they're underserved and how to create value in a very granular, specific level for different segments of the market.
Absolutely. Now, one of the interesting things, and maybe I hadn't been paying attention before, but I saw it on the slides today, was the idea that we're not just doing an operational job. We're doing an emotional job, we're doing a financial job in parallel. So can you talk about like the different, I'm going to call them dimensions of jobs that you could do? Because I think they're all important. So even when we're looking after the surgeon, there are other perspectives too, and maybe they affect the surgeon, maybe they affect the other stakeholders. But
sure, the way we group them is we again start with the core job executor, in that case the surgeon, who has that functional job. Right? But then we also define what we call related jobs and emotional jobs. We attach those jobs to the job executor. Right? So once we know what the core job is, get all those outcomes, we'll ask the surgeon, all right, while you're performing that surgical procedure, what else might you be trying to get done? Well, I'm trying to train my staff to be more proficient. I want them to be aware of my preferences. Okay, so these are other jobs that if we could help you get these jobs done in addition to performing that procedure, we'd be creating more value. Absolutely. So can we wrap some other service or tool or technique or something around our product to get more related jobs done? The answer is yes, we're creating more value for that job executor. So that's something we always look at. The emotional jobs as well. In the surgical space, doctors want to look professional, obviously, and they don't want mistakes. They have to avoid mistakes. So that brings some emotional component to that equation as well. And understanding that is critical. A lot of times we can, like if we solve functional problems and help them prevent mistakes or do things that make sure mistakes can't happen, then we're satisfying the emotional jobs at the same time we're satisfying their functional job. Again, that's why this is so important to look at this first. But knowing what those emotional jobs are, we can now market to that. We said, look, we added this function. It's going to help you, do these 3 or 4 things better from a functional standpoint. But it's also going to make you feel really good about this emotional job. And that's always a winning value proposition when you combine that. I mentioned the third type of job. It's the consumption job. So that job executor is not involved in the purchase or the setup. That's someone else is doing all that, at least in this case. In some situations, the job executor is also the person buying it, setting it up, and using it, and disposing of it, and so on. But in many cases, that's not true. When it's not true, then you have a whole different group of people you have to go talk to get their needs. And the last job you mentioned, of course, was the financial piece, and that's the buyer's job. Right? So once we know who the buyer is, we can go to the buyer and ask them, what are all the metrics you use to decide if you want product A or product B? In the medical space, we hear things like, the product has to reduce the patient's length of stay, for example, or reduce morbidity rates. Those increase, reduce time to turn over the OR room, or we hear a whole variety of things like that. Now they're not pertaining to the procedure itself, but they have the procedure and the way it's done can have some impact on those financial metrics as well. And those are all the components. There's a lot, right? So what we've learned is that in a typical situation, there could be 100, 200, 250 metrics cut across all these different areas that people are using to measure value. Those are the ingredients into the equation, right? Those are all the needs. That's ingredients. Throw them in there. Now you got to figure out which ones are most underserved, to what percent of the population, and why, and then you can systematically create solutions that address them. But it's defining what a need is and what types of needs exist. That's really been the big breakthrough.